At 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday night, 4 human beings hit the Pacific Ocean at 20 miles per hour. 20 minutes earlier, the spacecraft carrying them had been hotter than the surface of a steel furnace. For 6 straight minutes, every screen in mission control had gone dark. No telemetry, no voices, no way to know if any of them were still alive. They were. Barely. And the heat shield that brought them home had been broken before it ever left the launch pad. NASA knew. They flew it anyway. This is the story of what just happened, and how close it came to never happening at all. Lead entry flight director Rick Henfling described the final descent in one sentence that haunts everyone in the room when you hear it. He called it 13 minutes of things that have to go right. Every single one of those things did. Almost none of them were guaranteed to. NASA's own internal risk assessments put the odds of losing the Artemis II crew somewhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 2. At the optimistic end, that's a 2% chance of 4 people dying on live television. At the pessimistic end, it was a coin flip. NASA's official threshold for acceptable mission risk is 1 in 30. They flew anyway. Because the alternative was killing America's return to the moon for another decade. What follows is the inside story of those 13 minutes. The broken shield, the silent room in Houston, and a 6-minute window where physics had the only vote that mattered. Everything you're about to hear actually happened. None of it was supposed to happen this way. To understand why the heat shield was broken, you have to go back to November 2022. That's when Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight, came home from its own loop around the moon. By every metric, the mission was a triumph. The rocket worked. The capsule worked. The trajectory worked. The celebration lasted exactly until engineers got the spacecraft back to Kennedy and pulled the heat shield off to inspect it. Over 100 locations showed unexpected damage. Large chunks of charred material had cracked and broken away in jagged, irregular patches. Some had exposed layers of the shield that were never designed to face re-entry temperatures directly. The material is called Avcoat. Think of it like a candle that melts itself to keep the wick safe. As the spacecraft slams into the atmosphere, the outer layer chars under the heat. The char absorbs enormous amounts of thermal energy. Then it erodes away into the airstream, carrying that absorbed heat with it. Layer by layer, the shield sacrifices itself so the 4 people behind it stay alive. NASA used Avcoat on every Apollo command module that came home from the moon between 1968 and 1972. It worked flawlessly 6 times in a row. So when they designed Orion, they reached for what they knew. But there was a difference. Apollo shields were built by hand. 320,000 tiny hexagonal cells, each one filled individually with Avcoat by a technician with a tool and a lot of patience. It took months. For Orion, Lockheed Martin simplified everything. Instead of hundreds of thousands of cells, they manufactured 186 pre-machined Avcoat blocks and bonded them onto the carbon fiber skin like puzzle pieces. Faster. Cheaper. And, it turns out, it didn't behave the same way. The Artemis I damage traced back to one specific maneuver. The capsule had performed something called a skip re-entry, diving into the upper atmosphere, then bouncing back out like a flat stone skipping off a pond, then plunging in for a final descent. The advantage was precision. Skip re-entry let mission planners pick a more flexible splashdown zone. Apollo never had that luxury. But during that bounce, when external heating dropped, something inside the Avcoat went wrong. The material was still hot underneath, still releasing gases through a process called pyrolysis, basically burning without oxygen. But the char layer above it had become too dense for those gases to vent. Here's what was happening inside the shield. Picture a sealed plastic water bottle that you forgot in your car on a hot day. The pressure builds slowly until something has to give. That's exactly what happened to Avcoat blocks during the bounce phase. Pressure built up inside them, and when the capsule plunged back for round 2, those pressurized pockets ruptured, blowing chunks of shield off into the slipstream. And that's exactly the kind of behavior that was about to happen again, at 24,000 miles per hour. Unless NASA could change the rules of the descent itself. The investigation took 2 years. By the time NASA understood the root cause, the Artemis II capsule was already built, already bonded with the same flawed shield. Replacing it would have meant another 2-year delay on a program that had already slipped from 2024 to 2025 to 2026. So Administrator Jared Isaacman, a man who has personally orbited Earth aboard a SpaceX Dragon and who understands spaceflight risk from inside a pressure suit, not from behind a desk, made the call. Fly the broken shield, but change everything else. The skip reentry was eliminated, gone. Orion would come home on a steeper, more direct profile, hitting the atmosphere harder, but for a shorter time. No bounce, no pause where trapped gases could pressurize and fracture the shield from inside. The trade-off was brutal in a different way. Higher G-forces on the crew, more intense peak heating, a narrower splashdown window, less margin for error in every direction. NASA tested the new profile in ArcJet facilities at Ames Research Center, blasting Avcoat samples with conditions worse than anything Artemis I had seen. In every simulation, the cabin held. They believed the math. But math is not the same as 4 people falling through fire at 35 times the speed of sound. That's where the story picks up, Friday afternoon. At 2:53 p.m. Eastern, 250,000 miles from home, Orion gave itself a final shove. 8 seconds of thruster fire, just enough to nudge a parking bay's worth of velocity. After 10 days in space, that was the last steering correction the crew would make. Everything from here was gravity. By 7:33 p.m., the European-built service module that had powered the entire mission separated and burned away in the atmosphere behind them. Everything disposable was gone. All that remained was a capsule the size of a large SUV, falling alone toward Earth at 24,000 miles per hour. That's roughly 6,500 miles per hour faster than the International Space Station moves. To put it another way, Orion crossed the entire continental United States in about 8 minutes. At 7:53 p.m., the capsule hit entry interface, 400,000 feet above the Pacific, traveling at 35 times the speed of sound. The crew began experiencing G-forces that would climb to nearly 4 times Earth's gravity. Imagine someone standing on your chest while you're being pushed face first into an oven. That's roughly what Tuesday afternoon feels like for an Orion crew during peak re-entry. Except a normal kitchen oven tops out around 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat shield was about to climb past 5,000. At those speeds, air doesn't move out of the way. It can't. So it stacks up in front of the capsule, compresses, and bursts into plasma. Picture lightning, except instead of a single bolt, it's a glowing wall completely surrounding the spacecraft. That plasma sheath did exactly what physics promised. It choked off radio signals like fog around a flashlight. The signal died. In Houston, Rick Henfling and his entry team watched their screens go blank. They'd trained for this silence for years. Simulation, though, is not the same as the real thing. In real life, you know that 4 friends are inside that quiet capsule. In real life, the seconds don't behave like they did during practice. They stretch. 6 minutes, NASA had told everyone. The blackout will last 6 minutes. Apollo 13's blackout in 1970 was supposed to last 3. It stretched to 4, then 5, then 6. By the time Charlie Duke heard Jack Swiggert's voice cut through the static, the room had nearly broken. Henfling's team was waiting on the same kind of silence, knowing that the last time someone tried this kind of re-entry profile with this kind of shield, the shield had cracked in over 100 places. In the visitor gallery a few floors away, families were waiting. Christina Cook's husband, Reed Wiseman's daughters, Jeremy Hansen's wife. They had been told, in the calm, professional way that NASA tells these things, that there would be a 6-minute window where nobody could speak to the spacecraft. 6 minutes is a short time when you're watching a movie. 6 minutes is forever when the person you love is on the other end of it, surrounded by plasma, behind a shield that broke last time. The crew, meanwhile, was busy. There is no panic on a properly trained re-entry. There is checklist. There is procedure. There is the windows turning the color of a welding torch and the cabin filling with the deep vibration of an entire atmosphere ripping itself apart against the heat shield 3 feet behind your head. Christina Cook had spent 328 days in space before this, the longest single space flight ever flown by a woman. She knew, more than anyone in that capsule, what the body could survive. She had reviewed the heat shield investigation. She had seen the photographs of the Artemis 1 damage. She had read the risk numbers and understood what 1 in 50 meant. She got in anyway. At 8:03 p.m., 6 minutes after the blackout began, something changed on the screens in Houston. A flicker. A fragment. Then a voice. Orion had punched out the bottom of the plasma sheath. The capsule was now passing 22,000 feet, slowing to a few hundred miles per hour. 2 drogue parachutes deployed, snapping open in the thin air to stabilize the capsule like a kite catching a sudden gust. A minute later, at 6,000 feet, the drogues released, and 3 enormous main parachutes unfurled, each one 116 feet across, big enough to cover most of a football field. They slowed Orion from 300 miles per hour down to a final descent of just 20. And then, at 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time, the capsule hissed into the Pacific Ocean about 40 miles off the coast of San Diego. Mission Control called it a perfect bullseye. Flight Director Rick Henfling later said he'd never seen a landing that precise in his career. Inside the capsule, Commander Reed Wiseman keyed his microphone and reported all 4 crew members were doing well. In the family gallery, somebody started crying. In Houston, the controllers stood up. They didn't cheer right away. They just stood. The way you stand when something you've been holding in for a decade finally gets to leave your chest. Here's the part nobody is saying loudly enough yet. The shield held, but it held by the slimmest margin of engineering judgment in modern American spaceflight. NASA flew a known broken component carrying 4 irreplaceable lives because the only other option was admitting that the road back to the moon was closed. Inspectors will spend the next several weeks pulling the heat shield apart, measuring exactly how much char came off this time, mapping every blackened crater on its 5-meter face. Whatever they find will determine whether Artemis 3 launches with this same design or with the redesigned, more porous version that's already being prepared for future missions. For 54 years, no human being went farther than a few hundred miles above the Earth. We had the rockets. We had the people. We had everything except the will to send anyone past low orbit. Then, at 8:07 p.m. on April 10th, 4 people fell through 6,000 degrees of fire in a capsule that probably shouldn't have flown. And the road back to the moon opened again. Artemis 3 cannot launch until Artemis 2 proves the ride home is survivable. Artemis 2 just did. Somewhere in the Pacific tonight, a charred and salt-stained capsule is being lifted onto the deck of a Navy ship. It looks like a rough black bell, scarred from end to end. Engineers will study it for months. They'll write papers about it for years. But for everyone else, for you and me, and anyone who looked up at the moon as a kid and wondered if we'd ever go back, that scarred bell means something simpler. It means the silence broke. The signal came home. And for the first time in 54 years, somebody is already drawing the next map. So the next time you see the moon hanging up there in your sky, remember, 4 people just came home from there on a shield with cracks in it. The moon isn't just bright tonight, it's open.